Lu Ruoro had walked 3 days down from the mountain with a satchel of dried herbs tied at her waist, her palms still smelling faintly of pine and bitter root. The city rose before her in glass and stone, a world of neon reflections and careful courtyards where the air tasted of incense and exhaust. She had come not for glory, but because an old neighbor from the village, who had been a cook in the Lin household years ago, had sent word. The master cannot eat well. They do not know what ails him. Ruworo's angers tightened around the satchel. The hands that learned how to steady a limp pulse and coax a stubborn fever into calm had grown bold in the mountains. She would not shrink now. If you enjoy this story, stay until the end and consider subscribing and liking. Your support brings more tales like this. Inside the Lin mansion, Lin Shuyan moved like a man who measured his steps against an internal clock. The housekeeper announced him in soft, controlled tones whenever his appearance might unsettle the gathering. He was young for his responsibilities, his jaw clean-shaven, eyes the steady gray of someone who had learned to watch people as if they were puzzles to be solved. For years, he had carried a fragility behind the neat fold of his collar, a hereditary rhythm in his chest that sometimes came with a pressure behind the ribs and a fog over the vision. Doctors in the city's top hospitals had given names and warnings. His father gave orders and suggestions, but answers had often come in fragments, like old paintings flaking at the edges. When he first saw Ruworo at the gates, mud-smudged hem, unspooled braid wrapped once with a faded red ribbon, there was something about the way she stepped past a row of polished boots without lowering her head that arrested him. She did not shrink from the grandeur. She did not inflate before it. She carried both humility and a bluntness that required no performance. "You're not a Lin family medic," his younger cousin said under her breath at that moment, the tone equal parts amusement and class consciousness. Lin Shuyan's mouth twitched at a smile he could not afford. He found himself watching Ruworo as if she were a live thing in his household's preserved garden, something unexpected, and therefore, in the language his life had been taught, unacceptable, and also, for reasons he did not yet admit, necessary. The call had come 3 days earlier. Lin Shuyan's grandmother, the family matriarch, had taken a bad turn after a dinner where she could not keep any of the food down. The household physician insisted it was indigestion, aggravated by anxiety. The matriarch's attendants insisted that the family reputation could not suffer rumor. The Lin patriarch, practical and remote, decided to bring an outsider only because an old debt had been owed to the village Ruworo called home. When his father was a young man, a woman from that mountain had once delivered an herb that steadied a fever. Names in the Lin mansion had long after turned to ledger entries, but customs had roots deeper than ledger ink. Ruowo was shown into a chamber where lantern light softened the carved panels. The air smelled of camphor and jasmine. The matriarch's breath came in baby-soft rasping puffs. Ruowo knelt without ceremony and took the woman's wrist. Her touch was firm, confident. She listened to the old woman's pulse as if to a story. "Too rapid in the left cun, slightly tight behind the chest," she murmured. The dish at dinner had coriander, cilantro, and there was oil old with spice. Her stomach resisted because the gallbladder was cold from damp. She needs warmth, then movement of qi. Give her ginger broth and a moxa at the Shangwan point. No raw, cold vegetables, no strong alcohol. Conversations in the Lin mansion froze like water. The cook's face drained of color. The family physician, a man with Nate spectacles and a ledger of certainties, frowned, and then, swallowing pride, asked for the herbs. Ruowo moved like a small, urgent wind. She unrolled her satchel, pulled out a dry root, and with clean hands set to steaming a simple broth. She laid her fingers along precise points of the matriarch's sternum and spoke the names of acupuncture places with the calm certainty of someone who had grown up naming stones and medicinal springs. Lin Shu-Yuan watched it all from the doorway. There was a narrowness to his chest like a band pulling in. Not then, but the thought of his own fragility surfaced as a shadow. He had been through the doctor's rooms and hospital corridors enough to know that most treatments were a string of small compromises and 1,000 small evasions. The way Ruowo worked, her certainty, her confidence without airs, cut through the mansion's polished protocols. There was truth in her hands. Days unfurled into a peculiar rhythm. Ruowo became, at the Lin home, a necessary ingredient that no one had planned for. She moved between the servant quarters and the main halls like a living instrument of repair. She mended a child's fever with an iced compress wrapped in cloth. She argued with a steward about the proper way to have the rice soaked before cooking for the ailing. She refused to be ornamental. The family watched, some with polite curiosity, some with suspicion sharpened into steel. Liu Xinyan watched with a different hunger. She had been raised on lessons of how to glide into rooms and make them bend. Sun Yan, her mother, had taught her that the proper angle of a smile could make a title permanent. Where Ruowo's hands were plain, Xinyan's gloves were silk. Where Ruowo's voice used directness as a tool, Xinyan's used insinuation as armor. Xinyan had been promised Lin Shu-Yuan's name in society papers long before he had finished school. She expected the household to be hers by default. The presence of a village healer who smelled faintly of dirt and pine was an affront she intended to erase. At the family's spring banquet, the dining hall swam with chandeliers and silk banners. Lanterns hung in tones of vermilion and gold, and the air was thick with the sweet smoke of roasting spice. Servants moved like chess pieces, setting plates that glittered with sauces. Conversations made the sound of silk whispering. It was the kind of event where reputations could be elevated or crushed by the tilt of a fork. Xinyan chose the precise moment when the matriarch's mood was buoyed by the ginger broth. She placed herself at the side of the patriarch and leaned toward Lin Shu-Yuan with a practiced laugh. "Ruoro, you have brought rural remedies into such light. Do you know what you are up against? The Lin family does not run on moxa," she teased, thinly veiled poison. Ruoro did not flare with anger. She took a mouthful of a fragrant soup and caught the scent of coriander, cilantro, floating above the dish. Instantly, the memory of the matriarch's reaction, the bruise of the old woman's cheeks, the quickness of the cook's movements folded in her mind like paper. She noticed Lin Shu-Yuan's face as well, a small tightness as if his breathing had been nudged by the scent. Her eyes, which had been used to watching horses and goats, sharpened. "It was the coriander," she said plainly, voice carrying past the table. "It is not for everyone. Some have a sensitivity to it, an effect on the stomach and, in those with weak constitution, on the chest. If one eats it too often, it stirs the liver heat and can bring on palpitations. For those who have a family history of chest trouble, even a strong scent will teach the nervous system to flare." Conversations stilled into a curious hush. It was a small thing, a culinary observation, but said in that room and in that time, it was a correction of posture. Here, low-born knowledge had displaced high-born assumptions. Xinyan's smile thinned into a shadow of discomfort. The patriarch's jaw tightened. No one enjoyed being corrected in a room full of witnesses. Lin Shu-Yuan's gaze found Ruoro across the table. There was a moment, a small, dangerous second, where the world narrowed to the tilt of her chin and the faint dampness on the back of his hands. He felt seen by someone who did not then think of his network, his status, his obligations. She saw him, not as a name to be managed, but as a body with a certain rhythm. To see, for him, was to be liberated from the ledger. He surprised himself by thanking her with a single nod. That night, he asked privately if she would examine his pulse. He had never asked for such things in private. The request carried the weight of trust disguised as clinical curiosity. Your left guan is slightly vacus. The right qi is full but uneven. Your heart has a habit of racing when it is startled. You keep tension between your shoulders like armor. The medicine of patience, the kind that comes from breathing and calm, will not undo the family history, but it will make room. A few needles, properly placed, will help your chest relax. She did not offer miracles. She offered skill and presence and a plan that would not deprive him of his dignity. Lin Shuyan felt his breath steady under the soft weight of her touch. He let himself be treated, and in the small privacy of that moment, he let gratitude fold into an unfamiliar warmth. Not everyone in the household accepted this new presence with patience. Sun Yun, whose ambitions tightened like a vice, saw Ru Ruo as a threat to the arrangement she had charted for her daughter. Plans, after all, can be scuttled by the most ordinary types. A woman who knows which herb cools the liver, a girl who moves with the unreadable steadiness of someone who has seen storms and survived. Sun Yun began to plan in shadows the way a spider spins a web. It was Sun Yun's idea to smear. Rumors are a kind of weapon that leaves no bruises but can ruin a life. Stage a scene at the Crown Hotel where propriety could be questioned. Collect witnesses who would be eager to repeat the story. A false pregnancy claim might follow. Eyes wet in public and a single demand for marriage could steamroll a household that valued appearance above everything. The more complicated the lie, the more likely people are to believe it. Once a scandal is visible, cleaning it is costly. They picked a night where the Lin family hosted a small gathering at the hotel's private dining room. Xin Yun would feign composure and consternation at being slighted. An arranged schedule of exposures would begin with a whispered note from a supposed maid. The plan required complicity, some of which Sun Yun could buy. There were always staff who owed more than their wages, who could be persuaded by the right sum. Ru Ruo heard about the hotel gathering not from rumor, but from the man who had once been the village cook, now retired and hiding smiles in the Lin kitchen. They will test her, he warned. Ru Ruo, who had learned in the mountains that tests come in forms both gentle and cruel, tied her satchel and did not speak of fear. She had come for the sick and stayed for the truth. She would not run from slander. The night at the Crown Hotel was a study in appearances. Crystal reflected chandeliers until the room looked like a pond of stars. Conversations flowed like lacquered silk, and laughter was measured. Ru Ruo sat at the edge of the gathering, invited as a small curiosity. Xin Yun sat like a poised statue of entitlement. Sun Yun watched with a smile that could be folded into knives. Later, as planned, a waiter, paid to be inattentive, saw Ru Ruo leave the private room for a corridor and report to the conspirators that she had been seen in a compromising situation with a delivery man. The rumor crested into gossip and spread. A photograph, cropped and suggestive, found its way into a message to the patriarch. It was not a photograph of what had happened, but of bodies in a doorway, a blurred gesture, someone's shadow. The household reacted with the speed of men trained to protect names. Denial, then haste, then a will to punish. Ru Ruo woke the next morning to find herself the subject of a whispered campaign. A video clip she had never known about surfaced on a social feed managed by the household's younger cousin, someone who believed that sensational stories were currency. She was named in ways that might stick to her life like tar. The Lin mansion, which had been curious yesterday, looked like it had turned its head away from her. She had been raised to expect gossip. She had not been raised to wear it. She went to Lin Shuyuan because that was the only constant she had been given there. He received her in the old sunroom, where jasmine draped like pale muslin over the windows. She expected a rebuke. Instead, she found him unusually quiet. "Are you all right?" he asked, the words cautious. "No," she said, and let the word be small and honest. "But it is not the first time someone has been tested for courage by the world. They will say what they say." His eyes darkened. "They will say nothing if I say nothing," he answered simply. "I know it's a frame. I want you to know that I believe you." The simplicity of that sentence astonished her. It was not the defense shouted in public. It was a private clause of solidarity, and it shaped her resolve like a blade tempered in cool water. "Then help me fix it," she said, not with words, but with evidence. He was not a man who spent his time in the small mechanics of investigation, but he could call on resources. A local hotel owner who still kept paper records, a technician who understood how footage could be backed up, and a small, reformed muscle named Chen Xiao who owed him favors. They moved in practical silence. Fu Chen, an artist friend of Rurowo's who had come to the city years earlier and kept a studio full of half-finished canvases, provided an unexpected key. He knew the layout of the hotel's back stair, the delivery routes, the faces of regular staff. Li Fugui, the quirky mentor who had once taught Rurowo how to set a bandage, ran a small herbal stall and could read the color of someone's tongue by the light of a single candle. They worked like a ragtag sleuthing party, less refined than a detective agency, more relentless. The first hurdle was the hotel's CCTV. The footage of the corridor where Rurowo had supposedly been seen had been, conveniently, overwritten, according to the hotel's manager. But the manager's ledger showed a discrepancy, a log of a van that had left at an unusual hour. Fu Chen pressed his paint-lined thumb into the hotel's owner's conscience and learned of a deleted backup stored on a physical hard drive by a junior staffer fearful of being shut out of the business. They moved in practical silence. Fu Chen, an artist friend of Rurowo's who had come to the city years earlier and kept a studio full of half-finished canvases, provided an unexpected key. He knew the layout of the hotel's back stair, the delivery routes, the faces of regular staff. Li Fugui, the quirky mentor who had once taught Rurowo how to set a bandage, ran a small herbal stall and could read the color of someone's tongue by the light of a single candle. They worked like a ragtag sleuthing party, less refined than a detective agency, more relentless. The first hurdle was the hotel's CCTV. The footage of the corridor where Rurowo had supposedly been seen had been, conveniently, overridden, according to the hotel's manager. But the manager's ledger showed a discrepancy, a log of a van that had left at an unusual hour. Fu Chen pressed his paint-lined thumb into the hotel's owner's conscience and learned of a deleted backup stored on a physical hard drive by a junior staffer fearful of being shut out of the business. They moved in practical silence. Fu Chen, an artist friend of Rurowo's who had come to the city years earlier and kept a studio full of half-finished canvases, provided an unexpected key. He knew the layout of the hotel's back stair, the delivery routes, the faces of regular staff. Li Fugui, the quirky mentor who had once taught Rurowo how to set a bandage, ran a small herbal stall and could read the color of someone's tongue by the light of a single candle. They worked like a ragtag sleuthing tree, less refined than a detective agency, more relentless. It was the kind of small human greed that made conspiracies possible and also their undoing. They found the junior staffer at a tea stall, hands stained with grease and eyes furtive. Chen Xiao sat with a quiet, non-threatening presence and spoke of the easy arithmetic of favors and debts. "We can do right," Chen Xiao said simply, "or we can do wrong again." The man confessed he had been paid to remove footage. He had obeyed because fear had been louder than courage. He handed over the hard drive. Fu Qiu and a technician named Zhao Huan set to work on a battered bench under the hum of a street lamp. The hard drive's data was fragmented, dead in places, but a sliver of footage survived, badly compressed, grainy, but with a clarity of shadow and movement that told a different story. In the corridor, a hand appeared, not the silhouette of a lover, but of someone steadying another person who had grown faint. A cluster of stacked boxes and a uniform that belonged to a delivery driver, identifiable by a logo the cook remembered, told the outline of truth. Roro had helped a man who had tripped carrying a crate. Someone had staged the rest. It was not glamorous proof, but it was enough to make a declaration at the right time. Lin Shuyuan called a family council and asked for a private audience. He did not shout, he did not storm. He presented the reconstructed footage in the drawing room, where the family had gathered to gossip in hushed, critical voices. The room sucked in breath. Sun Yan's smile was the color of brittle leaves. Xin Yan's hands, folded like a fan between her knees, trembled. "You will apologize," Lin Shuyuan said to the family, voice steady but iron. "To Liu Roro." The apology did not come with the kind of arrogance Sun Yan had expected to wield. Instead, under the weight of the evidence and the quiet resolve of the young master, the household shifted. Roro, who had dined on humble porridge and mountain air, found herself the center of a different kind of attention. Not the clumsy curiosity of the privileged, but a careful, curious scrutiny that mixed relief with suspicion. Yet Sun Yan and Xin Yan did not disappear into contrition. Villains in old stories rarely vanish simply because a light is shown on their deeds. The next move, as a matter of cruel practicality, was to escalate. If rumor would not stick in this household, they would ensure a scandal elsewhere. That night, Roro found a note tucked inside her satchel, a single line of threatening ink. "There are shadows in every room," it read. "Learn to keep your head down, or we will remove your feet." The words could have been monstrous, but they were banal in their cruelty, a demand that she vanish. Roro folded the note like she folded medicinal leaves, carefully, as if to preserve something fragile. She would not be cowed, but she would not leap without a plan. The world had taught her that bravery without strategy is vanity. Her boldness grew into action. She spent days sitting with Lin Shuyuan as they devised ways to protect not only her reputation, but evidence and those who would stand with her. She taught the younger servants basic bandaging and how to keep notes. Lin Shuyuan, in small ways, learned to be less a man who managed crises by delegating and more a man who stood physically beside the people he cared for. Once, in the pale wash of early morning, he found himself in the yard teaching a kitchen boy how to hold a lantern, while Ruro taught the same boy which roots to avoid when boiling broth. Their moments together carried a slow tenderness. They were not extravagant, a cupped tea handed across a corridor, a bandage laid with fingers that lingered an instant too long, the shared silence of two people who had seen too many complications and were learning to invent simplicity. The familiarity of those small acts made their bond less headline and more root. It grew under the soil of routine, unseen by those who only looked for the spectacle. And yet, the world requires spectacle. When the Lin family hosted a small charity unveiling of an art auction, Ruro stood in the crowd and watched a painting that had been sent by Fu Qiu, a landscape of mountain ridges painted in the soft wash of memory. The painting's brushwork held the scent of her childhood, and she felt, briefly, the tug of home like a string. The painting was placed beside an ornate portrait that the Du family had donated. It was a careful replica of a famous masterwork, polished until the face in the frame could make a room hush. Xin Yan, standing taller than ever in the gilded light, pointed at the portrait and smiled a smile that moved the room in her favor. "What is genuine," she said to the gathered patrons, "is what carries history. The city must never forget its foundations." Fu Qiu, who watched Rurowo with that mix of affection and mischief that only artists know, leaned close and whispered across. "Paintings lie as much as words," he said. "They flatter." After the event, a scandal of a different kind happened. A critic published a piece accusing the Lin family of exhibiting for social clout, and with it came a rumor that the Du family's portrait had been passed as original through a chain of eager hands, an accusation that threatened to drag the Lin family into disrepute by association. The Lin patriarch's face went ashen. Reputation, they all knew, was a fragile commodity. The thread that would snap the web, however, came from a place no one had expected: cilantro. During the charity dinner, a platter was brought to Ruroa's table without her asking, tied with fragrant coriander on top. She had by then noticed Lin Shuyuan's habit. He watched the seasoning before he ate, the same way a bird judges a tree before resting. When a tray of hors d'oeuvres brushed near his hand and a leaf of cilantro touched his wrist, his pulse jumped, minute but present. Rurowo's hand brushed his wrist as if to steady the tray, and the contact was so small a thing it could have been dismissed as accident. But later, when a forensics detail required a link to prove that Lin had been present at a private auction where he had claimed to be in one room while a questionable signature was affixed in another, it was that small touch, a smear of green oil on his cuff seen in a candid photograph, that would answer a question the tabloids had posed. A single leaf, stuck to a cuff, a fingerprint of authenticity that said he had been where he said he was. Sun Yan noticed, of course. She was practiced at reading the seams of a cloth to find fault. She saw at once that cilantro could be a proof not of weakness, but of truth. She recalculated. Her plans shifted like sand. If certain small things could prove innocence, other small things could be manufactured. It was at midnight, on a slant of moonlight that carved the courtyard into silver and ink, that Rurowo did not return to her small room. The satchel she always left by her pillows was gone, the red ribbon of her braid untied and threaded through the bars of her window as if by impatient hands. Chen Sha, who had the patience of a man who had been broken and remade, found footprints leaving the garden and then vanishing in the alley where delivery vans idled late. Someone had grabbed her while the night shielded their movement. Her disappearance was not dramatic in the way the tabloids might have loved. It was clean and clinical. The family reacted in a frantic choreography that was at once humane and self-interested. Lin Shuyuan sent men to search without displaying panic. Sun Yan ordered questions that hid their motives in concern. The household called in the police, though it was clear that the Lin patriarch's inclination was to keep matters quiet to avoid gossip. Lin Shuyuan refused quiet. He would not trade silence for the woman's safety. The following morning, a cryptic message arrived at the Lin mansion's front desk. A photograph of Rurowo's satchel opened on a hotel bed, an empty cup nearby, and a single line of text: "We have what you care about. Do not interfere." The handwriting was not coarse. It was the neat hand of someone who had practiced both cruelty and discretion. When Fu Chu reconstructed the hotel staff list, he found one name repeated: a security guard with ties to an old loan shark. The man had vanished the moment Chen Sha had begun to ask questions. There were gaps in the hotel's ledger, a deleted security backup, another missing witness. It was becoming painfully clear. Sun Yan's web had teeth and had decided to show them. Lin Shuyuan moved like a man who had learned to hold two lives at once, the life of a cautious heir and the life of someone who would not let fear decide for him. He called in a favor with the local police captain, who had once been indebted to the Lin family in ways that required moral currency now. He asked Li Fugui to search the mountain paths, knowing that village instincts ran deep and that not all people who took to the road wanted to stay lost. He asked Chen Xiao to track the delivery man who had been seen at the hotel's loading dock. When Chen Xiao brought back a scrap of linen with a faint-smelling trace of a medicinal salve, the very blend Ru Ru used for moxa treatment, they knew they were close. It was not proof in court, but it was proof in the stomach, a knot of undeniable worry that made action unavoidable. The rescue that followed was less cinematic than precise. A warehouse outside the city, a van with false plates, a few anxious men who had thought they were only taking orders, they were confronted with the choice of being liable or cooperative. When Chen Xiao and two men from the Lin household entered the dim space, they found Ru Ru bound but not broken, her wrists bruised, her braid in disarray, her satchel empty, but her expression resolute. She spoke little, as if every word spent would cost a piece of herself, but when she saw Lin Xiuyuan, she smiled with something like relief washed bright. They brought her back to the Lin mansion, where the matriarch, reborn with a sturdier appetite and a steadying breath, watched with a new softness. The household shifted in tone. Sun Yan and Xin Yan, confronted with the publicity of the kidnapping and the risk of legal repercussions, retreated into deniability. The police opened a formal inquiry. Evidence gathered by Chen Xiao, Fu Chu, and the junior hotel staffer made a mosaic of culpability that was not airtight, but was enough to force a confession from the man who had been the intermediary. Bought and pressured by San Yan's payments, he had arranged Ru Ru's abduction to be used as a bargaining chip. At last, the fragile, monstrous architecture of San Yan's plan began to crack. Publicity rose like a tide, and with public attention came scrutiny. The patriarch faced a choice between protecting his name by swallowing a quiet scandal or exposing the truth and risking the family's social position. Lin Xiuyuan, who had been taught the art of compromise, made his decision: the truth. He placed the evidence in the hands of the authorities and, more importantly, he spoke. On a cool afternoon that smelled of lemon and old wood, the household gathered on the veranda, and Lin Xiuyuan, who had come to know the weight of a single honest sentence, said plainly, "We were wrong." It was not an apology that erased the past, but, as admissions often do, it rearranged the present into a basis for change. Sun Yan and Xin Yan faced legal consequences, not temple burnings, but the slow, real humiliation of investigations and reputational loss. They would pay fines, they would lose opportunities. The will to perform in the social theater of the city would find diminished audiences. For Ru Ru, the aftermath was a different kind of healing. The matriarch, revitalized by Ru Ru's treatments and the family's renewed attention, regained enough strength to walk in the garden, where she rested her palm on the tea leaves and smiled. In private, Lin Xiuyuan took Ru Ruo to the very mountain where she had grown up. He wanted to understand the contours of her childhood, the spring where she learned to catch frogs with a child's gentle cruelty, and the ledge where she had first placed a soothing poultice on a neighbor's cut. They walked where the air smelled of pine and the soil gave underfoot like memory. At a stone altar, he picked up a handful of earth and felt the small, gritty truth of it. "You impressed me," he said quietly at the top of the ridge, looking out over fields that rolled like waves. "Not because you came into my life, but because you refused to be more or less than what you were." Ru Ruo, who had been taught to let praises fall past her like rain, felt somehow warmed. "You were not a ledger when you saved me," she said. "You were a man who could have turned away and didn't. That impressed me." They did not speak vows in the way of grand declarations. Instead, they made small promises: to be present, to guard each other's dignity, to mean what they said about supporting one another. In the mountain light that colored leaves gold, their hands found each other like roots searching for water. Yet life is not a single arc closed. It is a weave of threads that sometimes tangle and demand reweaving. As the Lin household settled its affairs and Ruruo carved a place for herself as both healer and fixture, a new inquiry dawned. Questions about the origin of the Du family's portrait and its authenticity came back to the surface. The critic who had accused the Lin family of courting scandal returned with a different angle. What if the painting that had become the center of the social gala was not merely a forgery, but a key to something larger? Documents tucked inside frames, signatures that had been bought and sold. The investigation required a return to the art world, to corridors where provenance mattered and greed found new hiding places. Fu Cho, whose canvases had been part of the conversation from the start, leaned forward with that exacting curiosity artists have for other artists' secrets. "A painting hides as much as it reveals," he said, and the work began anew. A careful peel back of layers, a slow interrogation of varnish and board. In the midst of that search, a letter arrived from a small clinic in the mountain village where Ruruo had trained. A man who had been a childhood friend, Jin Tao, had visited the clinic and left a small parcel with a note. "For Ruruo, there are places where courage is costly. You taught an old man to breathe, now let us help you keep the breath." Inside the parcel was a booklet of remedies and a small painting of cilantro, its green leaves rendered with a tenderness that made Ruruo laugh aloud. She lifted the painting to Lin Shuyuan. "It is from where I learned to be brave," she said, "and a reminder that even small things can be truth-tellers." He traced the green brushstrokes like a map. "Small things, indeed," he said. "Do you think the city will ever understand the value of that?" "Perhaps," she answered, "or perhaps not, but it will know that we tried." They had not yet finished their attempt at convincing the rest of the world, but they had begun a different kind of work, one of anchoring and of building. The Lin mansion, once a place of rigid circulation of status, softened into a home that learned to admit a messy human truth. Ruruo took a corner of the garden to grow herbs. She taught the household staff which leaves would calm stomachs and which to keep from the table. Lin Shuyuan, who once judged the world by metrics, learned the tricky arithmetic of favors and forgiveness, of apology and proper restitution. But stories demand more than fairness. They also need proof. The Du painting, at last, yielded a secret. Folded inside the stretcher was a ledger of names, receipts, tying a chain of earlier forgeries to a dealer with ties to Sun Yan. When Fu Chu exposed the ledger with the slow delicacy of an artist revealing a work's underpainting, the city's cultural bureau moved to reclaim the truth. It was not a dramatic courtroom scene, but a careful unweaving. Documents read, statements recorded, names catalogued. Justice often arrives in bureaucratic steps rather than thunder. This one was no different. Months later, with winter coming on and the Lin garden stripped to skeletal branches, Lin Shuyuan found Ruruo in the kitchen late at night, stirring a pot of soup with the quiet concentration of someone who knows that small things keep people alive. He brought her a small packet of letters, the rumor columns from the early days, the harsh words, the softened ones. He placed them in front of her. "Do you ever regret coming?" he asked, voice like a man who had practiced his question on 100 versions. Ruruo did not look up for a long moment. She let the steam from the broth fog her glasses and shook her head. "Regret is heavy," she said finally. "I would have carried a heavier weight if I had stayed. I wanted to heal, that is all." "And did you heal what needed healing?" he asked. She smiled at him then, small and sharp. "No, I only started it. Healing is a long labor. But I learned to be bold in a city that teaches modesty as armor. That is what impressed you, remember?" He laughed, the sound slow in the kitchen. "I think it was that you stood up in a room full of silk and told the truth about coriander." "And you listened." "Yes," he said, "I listened." Outside, the wind stepped through the empty branches, and the city hummed its distant, endless music. Inside the Lin mansion, two people who had been strangers, and then allies, and then something like family, sat at a worn wooden table, sharing a bowl of broth that tasted of moxa and hope. The world around them was still messy, still unfair at times. There would be more rumors, perhaps more machinations from those who had clung to power through shame. But Ruoro had taught them all a small, vital lesson: that a village girl's boldness could make a rich family reckon with its mistakes, that truth could be found in coriander leaf and in an honest pulse, and that courage does not seek to dominate but to steady. They would face the future together with the slow diligence of people who had survived rumor and kidnapping and had still chosen one another. They would plant cilantro in the Lin garden as an act of reclamation and as an intimacy cue. When his cuff caught green oil at a later dinner, they would both laugh, remembering the night it changed everything. And somewhere, in the half-light between justice served and a life rebuilt, the city learned to notice that sometimes the most important things arrive without fanfare. A woman with a satchel of herbs who refused to bow, a man who stopped counting his breaths and started counting the moments he held another's hand, a pair who preferred truth over ease. The Lin household moved forward, changed, chastened, and steadied. The scandal faded like a bruise, and new stories, quieter, truer, began to take root. But peace, as always, is a season. As winter thawed into a fragile spring, the message boards that once fed on scandal began to chatter about a new rumor, a missing ledger, one that suggested a deeper money trail tied to political donors beyond Sun Yan's reach. The discovery of the ledger that linked the Du painting to the dealer had not ended the story. It had only revealed another layer. Someone, somewhere, was still interested in protecting the old networks. Lin Shuyuan read the new article at dawn, his fingers tracing the lines. He closed the paper and looked toward Ruoro, who was kneeling by the garden beds, fingers deep in soil. Outside, the city began its daily clatter. He folded the paper and walked to her. "We will follow it," he said simply, "not for spectacle, not for headlines, but because truth requires tending." She looked up, soil on her palms, and nodded. "Then let us be gardeners," she said. "We know patience." They did not know then how tangled the next thread would be, nor how many more nights they'd spend unpicking hidden signatures and coaxing confessions from men who thought silence would save them. They only knew that together they were steadier than apart, and that a village girl's boldness had opened a door in the heart of a very proper house, and in the heart of a very proper man. The door was open. They stepped through into the next reckoning. They unfolded the paper on the kitchen table as if it were a map of frost-cracked earth. The article's headline glowed pale against dawn. "Missing ledger suggests donors beyond Lin interests." The words had the bluntness of a knife. The implication was deeper than theft. Someone had wanted the ledger gone because it showed not merely a misdeed, but a corridor, a route that led out of the Lin house and into places that did not answer to them. Lin Shuiwan smoothed the page and looked at Ruoro. For a breath, the garden's damp scent rose through the window and seemed to study him. "Where would anyone hide a ledger?" he asked. "Where would a man hide his guilt?" she answered, and the question held no humor. She came to the table and traced the faint watermark at the corner of the printed column, an old habit of hers. Paper told stories if you knew how to listen. Not in drawers, not in a safe if he feared a search. People who move things quickly use places used to being overlooked. They began where one always began, with the people. The Lin household was small in its staff, but dense with loyalties. May, the housekeeper, had been with them 10 years. She knew the pattern of their lives like the lines on her palms. The chef, an easygoing man who liked loud radios in empty rooms, had locks keyed to his apron. Then there were the newer faces, the assistants who came for short seasons and left with polite bows, the cousin who visited with a smile that never touched his eyes. May arrived with tea and a tremor of concern she did not bother to hide. Her apron pocket held a pen and a small notebook where she kept schedules and names. Ruowo watched her hands more than her face as she spoke. Hands, Ruowo believed, betrayed more than any face when a woman was honest. "No sound," May said Hurst. "I woke early and went to sleep the study. The window was latched. Nothing moved. But when I went back in the afternoon, the safety box—" She stopped, lips thinning. "Who had the key?" Lynn asked. "Only Mr. Lynn and the lawyer, and the house steward who came once a month." May's voice folded around lawyer like an old shawl around a thin shoulder. "The steward has been away this week. The lawyer—" She looked to Ruowo. "He left before dinner on the night of the gala. He did not return." They made the calls that people who lived in houses with histories made: the steward, the lawyer's assistant, neighbors. Each conversation left small residues of worry, a voice that cleared too loudly over the phone, an answer delayed not by distance but by caution. The lawyer's assistant said he had collected the legal files and taken them to a registrar's office for a routine update. The steward's family expressed bewildered apology. No one admitted to touching the ledger. Night laid itself early that week. Snow began in thin, indifferent sheets, not enough to speak of, but enough to turn the gardens green into a promise of white. Lynn and Ruowo sat by the lamp in the study, where once a hidden drawer held secrets in ink. They spread the old receipts and the copies they'd been compiling, photographs of signatures, names half obliterated by age, donor lists that dissolved into line items and then into intentions.
"Some protect names in different ways," Ruoro said. "Some hide them in silence. Some hide them in plain sight." She tapped a list where the handwriting had been labored, full of little ticks, as if the author had been counting something unseen. "This hand," she murmured, "is not an accountant's. It curves like someone who wrote long letters once." Lynn leaned close. The letters were rounded, the strokes stubbornly neat, with a small flourish under the G that repeated, a personal signature invisible to anyone who had not watched it for years. Could it be Sun Yan's clerk? He asked. If the ledger's reach extended beyond their enemies, it was possible it touched the nets that had once held political favors and quieted inconvenient questions. They decided to follow the handwriting, not the grand path of lawyers and donors. Those routes had guards and speeches. But the smaller track, the stationer who sold the paper, the binder who stitched volumes together, the courier who delivered packages before dawn. Their first stop was a narrow shop on a street where the pavement remembered shoes from other lives. The proprietor, an old man with a face like folded paper, ran his fingers over the edge of the pages they showed him and hummed like one who kept secrets as a matter of taste. "These binding techniques," he said, "are common in charity ledgers and in private accounts. But this ink—" He dabbed his thumb as though checking the humidity of ink. "Not industrial, home-blended, someone who writes with care." "Do you know anyone who binds like this?" Ruoro asked. He shrugged, then lowered his voice to a confiding rasp. "There is a workshop near the quay. Old women do the sewing, young men deliver. They think their hands are invisible, but hands usually tell more than eyes." The quay was a blue-nerved place, linen sails and men in caps, a harbor of small trades that did not register on the city's glossy maps. The workshop was a room crowded with half-made books and the smell of glue that had been used too long. A boy with a mole on his jaw looked up when they entered, then muttered at Ruoro's question. "We bind lots of things," he said. "If it's private, it comes wrapped in brown. If it's for a donor, it's stamped." "And who delivers?" Lynn asked. The boy scratched his head. "A courier, thin, always in a gray coat. He comes and takes the brown packages in the middle of the night, pays well." They trotted the name of the courier through the city's underside. A woman at a noodle stall who remembered him because he bought tea for the beggar with the missing front tooth. The lamplighter who had once seen him climb down a stair that led to the river. A fisherman who said he delivered parcels to a boat that never left port. At dusk, they found the boat, a hulking thing with blue paint scabbed by years of salt, moored to a post that had once held a fleet of hope. On its deck stood a man in a gray coat, tall and patient as the tide. He looked at them with eyes that had learned to measure questions. "What do you want?" he asked. "We want to know where the packages go," Lynn said. The man smiled the smallest smile. "People pay me to carry envelopes," he said. "Sometimes signatures, sometimes nothing but a hope. I don't ask. Curiosity gets people killed or rich." "Did you take anything from the Lynn house?" Ruruo asked. He cocked his head. "I took baskets and parcels for a man I met at the market. He said there was paper that must be moved so the house could sleep. Names don't sleep well." He flicked his thumb to the sky as if counting stars. The man wore a suit like a second skin. "Not from here. He paid in a way that made me pocket the coins and forget the faces." Lynn's jaw tightened. A suit that was not from here? That could be a sign of the networks they'd just begun to notice. Men who moved through cities without leaving footprints. Men whose names folded into other names. "Where did he meet the man?" Ruruo asked. "By the market, near the tea sellers. He left with a woman with 2 necklaces. The gray coat man's mouth shaped the phrase with a practiced calm. 2 necklaces, as though that was the detail the world kept forgetting. 2 necklaces. The clue was thin as thread, but threads were what they'd been following since the beginning. Coriander, stolen papers, a painting misattributed, a ledger gone missing. All of it braided into a net. They left the quay with snow falling softer now, as if the city itself had decided to hush. In the carriage back to the Lynn house, Lynn looked out at the dim facades and thought of obligations that desired to remain unnamed. Ruruo sat with her hands folded in her lap, the cuff of her sleeve still faintly stained by the garden's green oil where he'd brushed her wrist on a previous night. "We will need a list of those wearing 2 necklaces," she said finally, and there was a humor in it that did not want to be a joke. He looked at her, then smiled, and something in the way he folded the paper made it seem sacred for a moment. "We will make one," he said. "We will ask quietly. We will visit the tea sellers. We will sit in rooms where men do not think the poor have ears." Outside, a carriage rolled past, carrying 2 men in suits, a casual sight the city could not help provide. Lynn watched them, a little older now at the edges, and felt the conversation that must happen in rooms he had avoided for years. Conversations with people who had the power to tilt lists and turn laundries of public virtue into private bargains. There would be people who wanted them to stop. There would be small threats delivered as large favors. There would be men who smiled with 2 necklaces and left behind the faint scent of sandalwood and a name that meant nothing until it meant everything. Back in the house, May had laid out their tea and a bowl of glutinous rice as if to remind them that hunger is not only for bodies, but for truth. The lamp burned steady. The ledger was gone. The list of donors had spread its roots further than any of them hoped. "Let us begin with the market," Ruoro said,
and her voice was full of that steady, small insistence that had moved mountains of rumor before. They would learn who the woman with 2 necklaces was. They would learn which men favored sandalwood. They would learn whether the ledger was a single missing book or the first of many pages taken to disguise a system. They would learn how easily small favors become a net. Outside the window, someone planted a sapling in the Lynn garden where the coriander had been. It took root in the thawing soil, a quiet act of refusal against erasure, green against white, patience against the quickness of rumor. They would tend that garden. They would follow the ledger's ghost toward the men who loved silence. And, like gardeners, they would wait for the season when truth could be harvested without being bruised.